A key to successful retirement planning is the ability to match client cash flows with their spending plans. In essence, what we want to do as planners is to determine just how much the retiree is going to need to ensure that they never run out of money. We have to make a lot of assumptions. We make assumptions with respect to returns, we make assumptions with respect to planning horizon, and we have to make assumptions with respect to clients' initial spending patterns and with how much that spending is going to grow over time. At the end of the day, what we want to do, what we really want is to ensure that they never run out of money during this retirement period. So what I'm going to do is use age banding to discuss a systematic approach in dealing with this issue of client spending. So here's a picture of the way that we typically look at this problem. Um, this is something that you might have seen in the retirement course or in your basic finance course. It's utilizing, of course, time value of money. So we start off with assumption that a client needs $100,000 on day one of retirement. Social Security is going to cover 40,000, so the shortfall is $60,000. So this is how much the client is going to need to fund their retirement each year. Now we're going to, like I said, we make an assumption with respect to the inflation rate. We're going to use a 4% rate for a retiree, and we're going to assume a conservative return of 5%. So at the end of the day, that means that our real return is slightly less than 1%. And we're going to assume a 30-year horizon. So, of course, remember with time value of money, we have to use a beginning function, but we're going to plug in $60,000 as our payment on day one. We plug in all the other elements, and we find that the client needs almost $1.6 million for a successful retirement. Okay, so this allows the client to spend $100,000 on day one, assuming, of course, that Social Security is also going to grow at the rate of inflation, and to be able to grow their spending over time. But let's stop for a second and ask, where did we get that $100,000? Now, oftentimes in the capstone course, we're going to do it just by discussing the question with the client. Client says, well, I think I would like to have $100,000. It's not a very systematic approach at all. It's more of a guess. And sometimes it can become a bit of a dangerous guess. So some planners might go in and say, okay, well, let's take a little more of a systematic approach and just always assume that a client is going to need 70% of their pre-retirement spending or their pre-retirement income in order to get by in retirement. Okay, well, where does that come from? Well, it's kind of a top-down assumption. So we take the current income or the pre-retirement income, and now you can eliminate any work-related taxes, federal and state taxes, because you're not going to be making nearly as much income, Social Security, disability, and any other compensation taxes that are going to be withheld. Those can be fairly significant. There's other things that you're going to be taking out of the equation as well. Retirement contributions and any work-related expenses, lunches, clothes, travel, as well as any additional savings, because now the client is going to be in a dis-saving mode. Another way that you can do this, what I think is the best way, is to actually go and build a bottom-up budget based on actual spending records that you can get from, say, Mint or Quicken, Personal Capital. But this is hard work. It's something that you have to get a client to actually start to engage in. Not that many clients are willing to do it, but I think it's an excellent approach. Another element to this then becomes those expectations for future growth. We typically, again, when we did that problem a few minutes ago, we assumed that everything was going to grow at that inflation rate of 4%. I don't think that's a very realistic uh, estimate. I think we can actually do better. So these are questions that have been looked at over time by academics and by practitioners. One of the first really good papers on this was by Michael Stein in 1998, when he started to posit that retirees really have three different um, patterns that they go through. The initial pattern, right after retirement, is according to Stein, the go-go period. This is when a client is saying, I have time on my side. All of a sudden, I'm free to travel. And clients want to start to do far more things than they were able to do during those working periods. At some point, the client is going to slow down. This becomes what we call the slow go period. Client is still going to be socially engaged, still going to be active, still maybe doing some traveling, but not to the extent that they were before. Then the client's going to finally hit truly old age, the no-go period. This is a period when the client's really going to be sticking around more often, not traveling, not doing so much on a leisure basis. Um, Much more of their expenses are going to be shifted more towards healthcare. Bernanke then expanded on this a little bit while making an argument that most of the retirement models, at least up till that point, um, again, made this great assumption about spending patterns that led retirees to become very frightened that they were going to run out of money. Um, and Bernanke started to put out this issue that no, I don't think clients are spending nearly as much money. They really didn't go through anything quite systematic. Sam Basu, on the other hand, did start to break down on a more systematic basis both these spending assumptions and inflation questions. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but he started the whole idea of discussing what we refer to now as age banding. Blanchett went on to expand a bit more on that, but then he also looked at the initial spending pattern from the standpoint of how much were people spending prior to retirement. What he found is that not everybody cuts their spending when they get into retirement by the same amount. People who tended to be savers that were spending nearly as much of their available income would actually often spend more in their early retirement years than they were prior to retirement. On the other hand, people who had been spending a greater amount of their available income and not saving as much by necessity would cut back. And they could cut back 30, 40% on their spending in retirement. The other thing that Blanchett found was what we refer to as this consumption or the consumption smile. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in this recording, but what he really found was that there is a cut in real spending over time. Michael Kitces then looked even further at age banding. He simplified it to quite a degree, and he still came up, however, with the basic findings. It's that one, traditional methods of looking at client spending overestimated the spending growth. Clients can actually perhaps take a higher initial withdrawal rate by changing some of the assumptions, or clients may be able to have a more successful retirement with a lower level of assets. We're going to explore all of these as we discuss age banding. So the first question is, what really is age banding? Well, it's taking this thought by Stein of the go-go, slow-go, and no-go experiences that people go through in retirement, and say that each of these are sort of discrete. Actually, they're not. They kind of merge into each other, but there are periods when people are going to be during, say, the go-go period, they're going to want to do a lot of travel. They're going to want to do a lot more entertainment. Um, they're not going to need to spend nearly as much on healthcare because they're transitioning to Medicare. Despite all of the concerns and fears out there about the Medicare system, it's still a pretty efficient way to control healthcare spending. In the slow go period, we do age. So there's going to be a reduced desire to travel. Part of it is we've achieved most of our bucket list. We're going to see reduced basic spending. The mortgage hopefully has long gone away. Car debt, we're not going to be carrying nearly as much of. We don't need to perhaps have three cars. We don't have a second home, a vacation home. We've got reduced transportation needs. We're going to be spending more time locally. You get the idea. On the other hand, healthcare is going to start to tick up now as we get to these ages. And then when we get to that no go era, we're going to have greatly reduced our discretionary spending. We're going to have reduced our basic needs spending because we're going to be able to have downsized quite as much. And it's all going to be offset by much greater healthcare costs. So you want to be able to model these changes that are going to be going on by category. At the other, we're also going to find that inflation rates are going to vary by category. Again, when you get health care or discretionary spending, you might have quite a bit higher inflation rates. We've seen some of that. Not as high as oftentimes the media puts forward, but a higher inflation rate versus basic spending. If you've got your everyday needs, you can substitute. So in order to do that, what we needed to see is break down everything into basic spending categories. So this is what Basu did. He said, well, you can take housing, you can take all associated costs, utilities, etc. You can take food, your home insurance, a lot of your transportation needs. You can group these into basic needs. These are the kind of costs that are going to be repeated. They recur on an ongoing basis. But there's substitutability for a lot of these expenses. So they can be controlled by the fact that you're in some places, you're in a house or something, you've already paid off your mortgage, that's not going to go up. Insurance rates don't go up nearly as rapidly as the CPI. Food costs will go up, but you can start to eat in more often as opposed to dining out. So you get the idea that basic needs inflation is actually lower than what you see with the CPI. Healthcare, it's required. Some people may even choose to have more elective sorts of procedures. So healthcare has its own set of inflation needs that's going to be quite different than the basic needs. Leisure, because by its very nature, it's discretionary. It's going to likely have higher levels of inflation. Again, you can group it together. Then it becomes kind of a yes, I'm going to do it, or no, I'm going to do it. But no, I'm not going to do it. There's less kind of substitutability. Well, I could do this or I can do that. People, at least during the go-go era, are going to say, I've been waiting to do this, however. So again, they're going to be less sensitive to those inflationary issues. Gifts, wills, charity, well, there's not a lot of inflation involved. We come in with great plans. At the end of the day, it really is going to boil down oftentimes to the residue, what's left at the end of retirement. So that's not really going to grow at all. We're going to have the plans, they may stay relatively constant. And taxes are interesting because when you retire, like I said, there's going to be this big drop in your taxes because of the work-related issues. Capital gains taxes or taxes that you have to go through with respect to distributions on 401ks and IRAs, they don't even show up as a category. They're just going to go up as a reduction in your returns. So taxes as taxes they go down dramatically. And if some of these taxes are related to income producing properties or other areas, well, over time, again, a retiree may well be, if they need to, selling a lot of these additional income producing assets, which is going to lead to, again, even lower taxes over time. The idea that you see in this example on the top left is that you can have very different inflation rates. Now, Basu just plugged in two different numbers. So for basic expenses, for gifts and taxes, he just assumed a growth rate or inflation rate of 3%. And for healthcare or for leisure, the discretionary sorts of spending, he put in a 7%. You average it out, it's 4%. But you can see that the categories reflect a much different set of inflation rates. Now, what Basu did also is he said, when you're working, here are the expenses. Say for basic spending, it was $50,000. For leisure activities, travel, entertainment, was $20,000. But remember, what we said is that basic expenses will come down, taxes are going to come down a lot. But there's going to be a trade-off. The client is going to increase their entertainment, their travel, their leisure, so they're going to take a bump up. So he put in an adjustment factor to allow the planner to say, okay, now leisure is going to account for $35,000 or almost 35% of your spending as opposed to 20%. You can take a look at the numbers. But what was interesting in addition is that using the traditional approach, we would assume that spending in year 65, the first year, would go up perhaps 4%. In reality, spending goes down 6% through this adjustment in the first level of age banding. Now, between 65 and 74, spending then rises at the inflation rate for each of the respective categories. So basic spending goes from 45,000 to 58,700. Okay, so you can see the numbers, how these things grow. So at 75, however, we go from go-go to slow-go. So we go through the process once again of another adjustment factor. This time, basic spending goes down some more. As we continue to downsize, people really do start to eat in more often, so we find big cuts in food costs, and transportation continues to go down. Healthcare now goes up. However, even though we're on Medicare, there's going to be a lot more, say, drug needs. You're going to have more trips to the doctor. You're going to have to see more specialists. So you can expect to see more healthcare costs. Leisure spending, which had all of a sudden jumped up to be a fairly big part of the budget, now gets cut pretty dramatically. But it's still there. These clients are still socially active, but it isn't going to be nearly as great as it was during the go-go era. So now we go through all of these adjustments. We go through the same process again as we get into the 80s. Now, there's nothing magic about each of these three groups. It could be instead of the 65, you might have a client who decides to retire at 68. We go through the process. And they might be done with their go-go era when they're 72 or when they're 78. But you get the idea that you will have all of these adjustments that will go on that continue to increase healthcare as a percentage of spending as you get to the no-go period. And that leisure spending all of a sudden goes from a very significant portion to a very insignificant portion of the overall spend. But what we also see through this whole process is the total spend down at the bottom. So at age 85, the client can be anticipated to spend $162,000. This is nominal dollars, okay, not inflation adjusted. But using the traditional view, we assume that the client is going to need $250,000. Okay, so we've got spending at 85, which is 35% lower than the traditional view. What we find then is that age banding is really pretty consistent with this whole idea of studies and that Blanchett shows, is that there's a negative real inflation adjusted pattern. I just read something from BlackRock, which confirms that spending as you get into your 70s and especially in the 80s really doesn't go up even as much as Blanchett does, assumes, and it's significantly lower than we typically assume for retirees. So this is kind of that whole picture. Let me go back again um, at the prior slide. So if we take a look at the nominal growth rate, what we see is that up to age, between 65 and 74, that spending grew at a 3.6% rate. But when we make that shift to 75, all of a sudden that spending drops quite a bit. We've lowered the threshold so that by the time we're at 84, now spending over the whole period has only grown at a 3% rate. At 85, we drop it again. Okay? And so we get this point that Blanchett and Kitces show is that we call this the smile, the spending smile, that at the top, we're assuming this is the inflation rate, which we assume the spending was always going to grow, but on a compound basis, year to year to year, spending is actually much lower than we assume. It stays below the inflation rate. JP Morgan did a study in 2013, and they found the very same thing. What they did was to look at their clients so that they have very good records of what their clients are spending through their JP Morgan credit cards, etc. These are high net worth clients. So they did a cross section by age. Now they're not following the same people over time, but they still got pretty good data by the cross section. What they found was their clients' peak spending years were prior to, say, age 60. Then spending starts to come down so that you could see that in the client's late 60s, their spending would average 11% lower than in their early 60s. By their mid 70s, it's 10% lower. By the late 70s, another 7% lower. You can see it's very consistent. What we also see at the end of the day is that healthcare costs, that bottom slice, which can come down in the 60s, starts to rise fairly dramatically when the client's in their 80s. On the flip side, housing costs have come down fairly dramatically, as have most of the other costs. So the conclusion is again that clients, as they age, their spending does not go up. In fact, it tends to go down fairly significantly. And that's some of the findings that we find overall with age banding. You can model these discrete changes. And you can say, okay, as you work with clients, you're going to find that clients' priorities are going to change as the clients age. You can plan for that. Spending is also going to rise at less than the inflation rate within those periods. Okay? And also consistent with Blanchett's work, what you should assume is that the higher the pre-retirement spending pattern, the greater the drop is going to be when clients start to move into the retirement period. And again, the lower their spending relative to their available income, then the less you're going to be adjusting the initial years. But thankfully, those are the clients who are going to probably have quite a bit of money saved up in their retirement accounts. So, by reducing the spending growth rate from 4% in the earlier equation that we used to just 2%, reduces the client's needs, the amount of money that they have to have at retirement, from $1.6 million down to $1.2 million, a fairly dramatic drop of 25%. Or without a cut in the amount that the client saves, the safe withdrawal rate can easily go up to 5% without a reduction in the failure rate. This is what, excuse me, that Blanchette shows, is that the light blue line on the bottom is the odds of success of a successful retirement, not running out of money, using an initial withdrawal rate, the magic 4% that we always talk about, is roughly, what is my number, 72%. By using age banding, we find that the client, especially the clients that are going to be your clients that have usually around $100,000 budget, they can take up to 5% without any reduction in the odds of success. And I think that Blanchette's work wasn't going as quite as draconian as a lot of the work that age banding shows. That might be up more towards the 5.5%. So as you see, age banding is a very powerful tool that you should be using as you build out plans with your clients to determine just what they can budget over time, yet not run out of money.